We're going to be exploring the development of rights, in particular the evolution of human and civil rights. We may not be fully aware of all of our rights that we have, or how we came to have these rights, but we're going to find out. Rights are important because they protect us from abuse from the state, employers, and other individuals. Defending our rights is also important. Because of some of the individuals and events that we're going to explore here, we are able to hold the powerful to account. This is one of the pillars of a democratic society. We know that we're entitled to have all of our human rights respected, so let's explore some of the ways that human rights have evolved over time. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the European Convention on Human Rights, and other treaties cover a wide range of different rights. These rights began to emerge as a theory during the 17th and 18th centuries and were based mostly on political concerns. You may be familiar with the actions of powerful monarchs such as John I, King of England, who was forced to grant rights to his barons to stop taxing them unfairly. This resulted in the drawing up of what became known as the Magna Carta in 1215. You may also be familiar with the French Revolution that began in 1789. Enlightened thinkers believed in the defense of equality, freedom, and fraternity. These were rights that thinkers such as Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Voltaire wrote about in the 18th century. It had begun to be recognized that there were certain things that the all-powerful rulers should not be able to do, and that people should have some influence over the policies that affected them. The two central ideas were those of personal liberty and of protecting the individual against violations by the state. Rousseau did put forward the idea, however, that in order for the people to experience stability rather than chaos in their societies, they should give up small amounts of their personal freedoms. A ruler would then rule in the interest of the people. This he called the social contract. Rousseau's ideas had a major impact on later governments. Influences of Rousseau's social contract theory can be seen in the creation of the American Declaration of Independence from 1776. The Declaration of Independence was created in the aftermath of the American Wars of Independence, an armed conflict between American colonists and British soldiers which began in 1775. The Americans were fighting for their right to independence from British rule. In 1776, a five-man committee which included Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and Benjamin Franklin began to draft a formal statement of intent which outlined the independence of the 13 colonies of America. This statement became the Declaration of Independence and signalled the break with Great Britain. The document begins with the words, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed." Rousseau's ideas empowered people to fight for and protect their freedoms. The Declaration of Independence also sets out the organisation of government and the way in which people would give up unlimited freedom for the stability and security provided by a government. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen from August 1789 was inspired by the causes of the French Revolution, which began in May 1789. Tired of the social and economic inequality in France at the time, government debt, tax burdens, and resistance to reform by the French absolute monarchy, the citizens of France rose up against the ruling elite. The French monarch, Louis XVI, was arrested, found guilty of high treason, and executed by guillotine on the 21st of January, 1793. The Declaration is a document that outlines human and civil rights. It was drafted by the Abbé Sieyès and the Marquis de Lafayette in consultation with Thomas Jefferson, one of the founding fathers of the USA and the main author of the Declaration of Independence in 1776, which proclaimed US independence from British rule. Influential philosophers such as Jean-Jacques Rousseau contributed to the ideas that made up the principles of the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. Rousseau was concerned that the state must represent the general will of the citizens. The idea of the divine right of kings and the special rights of the nobility and the clergy were eliminated by the Declaration. Although the declaration was more of a statement of vision than reality, it did inspire other countries such as Vietnam, which references the opening line of the declaration in its 1945 Proclamation of Independence written by Ho Chi Minh. The Geneva Conventions are a series of treaties and protocols that establish the standards of international law for humanitarian treatment in war, particularly in relation to the protection of war victims. An agreement was made in 1949 in the aftermath of the Second World War, which updated the Geneva Conventions that originated in 1864. The idea for an international treaty governing warfare was first proposed by Swiss humanitarian Henry Durand, after he witnessed the suffering of wounded soldiers at the Battle of Solferino in 1859 in northern Italy during the Franco-Austrian War. The basic rights of wartime prisoners are defined in the conventions, along with protections for victims of shipwrecks, the wounded, and sick. Protections are also established for the protection of civilians living in and around a war zone. The conventions establish the rules or laws of armed conflict or war. These rules are universal. The conventions set out basic rules such as participants in the war should actively avoid targeting places where civilians are likely to be, such as schools and hospitals, and that all injured soldiers and prisoners of war should be given fair treatment. The Hague Conventions are a series of international treaties that were created during the peace conferences held at The Hague in the Netherlands in 1899 and 1907. The 1899 conventions concern the prohibition on the use of projectiles that disperse asphyxiating gas and the prohibition on the use of bullets that expand or flatten easily in the human body. The 1899 conventions also state that it is forbidden to destroy or seize the enemy's property unless such destruction or seizure be imperatively demanded by the necessities of war. The 1907 conventions address the rights and duties of neutral powers in naval war, the laws and customs of war, the status of merchant ships in the outbreak of hostilities, and the laying of automatic submarine contact mines, among many others. Convention 4 outlined the laws and customs of war on land, stating that each party to a conflict is responsible for all acts committed by individuals forming part of its armed forces. A belligerent party who violates the provisions of the regulations shall, if the case requires, be liable to pay compensation. In World War II, the judges at the military tribunal known as the Nuremberg Trials found that the rules set out in the 1907 Hague Convention were recognized by all civilized nations and were therefore accepted laws and customs of war. This decision meant that a country did not have to have ratified the 1907 Hague Convention to be bound by it. The Charter of the United Nations was signed on the 26th of June 1945 in San Francisco at the conclusion of the United Nations Conference on International Organization and came into force on the 24th of October 1945. The Charter includes the following declarations: to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war which twice in our lifetime has brought untold sorrow to mankind, and to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights. It also puts forward the dignity and worth of the human person in the equal rights of men and women and of nations large and small, and to establish conditions under which justice and respect for the obligations arising from treaties and other sources of international law can be maintained, and to promote social progress and better standards of life in larger freedom. Also included are commitments to practice tolerance and live together in peace with one another as good neighbours, and to unite our strength and to maintain international peace and security, and to ensure, by the acceptance of such principles and the institution of methods, that armed force shall not be used save in the common interest, and to promote the economic and social advancement of all people. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, or UDHR, is a milestone document in the history of human rights. It was born out of the traumatic events of the Second World War, specifically the extermination of almost 17 million people during the Holocaust, including 6 million Jews. After the war, governments across the world came together to create a list of all of the human rights that everybody in the world should enjoy. Eleanor Roosevelt was instrumental in the creation of this document. She chaired the UN Commission on Human Rights, which drafted the UDHR. The declaration was proclaimed by the United Nations General Assembly in Paris on the 10th of December 1948. It sets out 30 fundamental human rights to be universally protected. Some of the human rights in the UDHR include the right to life, freedom and safety, the right to legal protection, the right to a fair trial, and the right to be treated equally. The UDHR forms the basis for all international human rights law and is considered among the most important documents of the 20th century. It inspired people around the world to claim their rights and to understand that these rights should never be abused or taken away. The UDHR led to the creation of other international agreements, such as the International Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination in 1965 and the Convention on the Rights of the Child in 1989. The European Convention on Human Rights is an international convention to protect human rights and political freedoms in Europe. Drafted in 1950 by the Council of Europe, the convention came into force on the 3rd of September 1953. The convention was designed to incorporate a traditional civil liberties approach to securing effective political democracy, from the strongest traditions in the United Kingdom, France, and other member states of the Council of Europe. The convention guarantees rights and freedoms and prohibits unfair and harmful practices. The convention secures the right to life, freedom from torture, freedom from slavery, the right to liberty, and the right to a fair trial, among many others. The European Convention on Human Rights has played an important role in the development and awareness of human rights in Europe. It took its inspiration from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and offered a response from the Allied powers to prevent the serious human rights violations which had occurred during the Second World War from happening again. The convention was also a response to the growth of Stalinism in Central and Eastern Europe and designed to protect the member states of the Council of Europe from communism. There are 4 articles in the Convention on the Rights of the Child that are seen as special. They're known as the General Principles, and they help to interpret all the other articles and play a fundamental role in realizing all of the rights in the Convention for all children. These include non-discrimination, the best interest of the child, the right to life, survival and development, and the right to be heard. The Convention also contains a number of agreements to add further unique rights for children which are optional for countries. These are called optional protocols. These protocols urge governments to increase the minimum age that children can join the armed forces from 15 years, and to ensure that members of their armed forces under the age of 18 do not take part in direct armed conflict. They also provide detailed requirements for governments to end the sexual exploitation and abuse of children. They also require the prevention of children from being sold for non-sexual purposes, such as other forms of forced labour, illegal adoption, and organ donation. A final protocol allows children to submit a complaint to the United Nations when their rights are being violated and their own country's legal system were not able to offer a solution. In 1959, the UN General Assembly adopted the Declaration of the Rights of the Child, which defines children's rights to protection, education, healthcare, shelter, and good nutrition. The UN Convention on the Rights of the Child affirms that every child has a right to education. The purpose of education is to enable the child to develop to his or her fullest potential and to learn respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms. The general principles of the Convention which are relevant to education cover non-discrimination, the best interests of the child's right to life, survival and development, and the child's right to express opinions. These principles can serve as a useful instrument in discussions on how to reform schools. The Convention is the most rapidly and widely ratified international human rights treaty in history. The Convention changed the way children are viewed and treated. The unprecedented acceptance of the Convention clearly shows wide global commitment to advancing children's rights. Much has been accomplished since the adoption of the Convention, from declining infant mortality to rising school enrollment. These are just 10 milestones on the journey of the development of human rights. We still have a long way to go to secure full, universal human and civil rights. Questions remain about new rights that should be added in relation to the data that a government or company holds about you, the holding of DNA of suspected terrorists by governments, prisoners' right to vote, and whether we can ever expect that all countries will agree and uphold universal rights.